Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the December meeting of the Wilmot Township Committee of Adjustment. Before I begin, I'm not aware that anyone in the audience wishes to read the land acknowledgement agreement, so I will do so. We have gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional territory of the Neutral, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee and the Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish of the One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and to Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant and the First Nations, the Métis, and Inuit peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community. I'd like to introduce the members of our committee. We have Mr. Tyler Bowman, Mr. Steve Miller, Mr. Peter Rowe, and Ms. Louise Lalonde, and my name is Wayne Roth. We also have with us this evening Mr. Andrew Martin, who is our secretary and treasurer, as well as the manager of planning for the township and the township EDO, as well as Mr. Cameron Miller, who is a planner for the township and will be introducing the applications this evening. We are an independent body appointed by Wilmot Township Council, and we have the power to make minor changes to existing zoning regulations and to approve some changes to existing non-conforming uses, as well as to give consent. Each applicant will be notified in writing of the decision within 10 days of this meeting, and with that, the decision will be the instructions on how it can be appealed. Any decision made by this committee can be appealed to the Ontario Land Tribunal, who will then hold a meeting and make a final decision. And this is a major change due to Bill 23. Only the applicant and certain prescribed public agencies can appeal the decision of this committee. If the decision on a minor variance or consent is not appealed, it will become final and binding within 20 days from the date of this meeting. The format of the meeting will be as follows. We will ask Mr. Miller to introduce each application. The applicant will then be invited to come forward if they wish to make any comments or additions to the application. Following this, anyone in the audience will have the opportunity to comment on the application. Then we will turn it over to members of committee who may question the applicant or have any questions answered as they see fit. The committee will then make a final decision. Mr. Miller, would you please, another minor change, we're dealing with both applications this evening because it involves the same property, which is a variance and a consent at the same time. I'm sure everyone is aware of that now. So, Mr. Miller, would you introduce the applications, please?
Thank you, Mr. Roth. Yes, that's correct. I'll be introducing both the minor variance A17/22 and consent application B05/22 as they both concern 12 Milton Street in New Hamburg. So minor variance submission A17/22 is proposing to amend the regulations for a single detached dwelling. So to reduce the side yard setback for a two-story dwelling from 2 meters to approximately 1.5 meters, to reduce the minimum lot width requirement from 15 meters to 12.75 meters, to increase the maximum allowable driveway width from 50% of the lot width to 54%, and to increase the maximum allowable garage width from 65% of the width of the residential building to 69%. So this property is currently developed with a single detached dwelling with a vacant portion of the property to the west of the existing home. Approval of the variance application would facilitate a severance of the property to create a new residential lot under consent application B05/22. In circulating the application, GRC has requested that a site-specific geotechnical engineering assessment be completed. So this requirement has been implemented as a recommended condition of consent. And the owner would also be required to obtain a GRCA permit prior to development of the severed parcel. In circulating the application to the Township's Infrastructure Services Department, they requested some standard conditions of consent to be imposed to secure approval of a preliminary lot grading, drainage and site servicing plan for the proposed severed lot. And the recommendation for BO5/22 contains, among other things, provisions for easements to be registered on title if necessary for drainage purposes, which would be an outcome of a future review of this lot grading and drainage plan. It would also need to be in place prior to issuance of a building permit for any new dwelling, so there are several checks and balances that are in place to ensure that this is completed. Staff has also attached comments that were received from the neighboring property owner. The comments include concerns regarding trees that were removed, reduced setbacks, and drainage impacts on their property. So presently, the removal of trees is not regulated by the township. Having said that, the township has recently retained a consulting firm to undertake a tree canopy study, and so this study will provide a framework for potentially regulating tree removal on private property. So staff do acknowledge the remaining concerns put forward by the neighboring property owner, but staff are of the opinion that the concerns regarding drainage will be adequately addressed through a future lot grading and drainage plan. There are a number of variances requested tonight. However, staff are of the opinion that the nature of the requests are extremely minor and remain consistent with lot sizes and setbacks utilized throughout the township. With respect specifically to garage width and driveway width, the proposed requests are insignificant and amount to actual increases of around 1 and 2 feet respectively. So without the variances to the side yard setback, garage, and driveway widths, a home could still be constructed with an equal or larger footprint than what is proposed. It is simply proportionate to the overall facade of the home. The recommended conditions of consent provide sufficient measures of control prior to the creation of the lot. Also, I should acknowledge that in the staff report, there is a correction in the labeling of the conditions. So specifically, condition number 10 should read 1 to 9 rather than 1 to 6, so that it encompasses the list of conditions. So this change would be corrected on a future decision. However, I thought I would just bring attention to that minor detail that will be corrected. Staff are recommending approval of the variance and the consent. Thank you.
If anyone in attendance virtually would like, if they can use the raised hand function on the screen, we can join them to the meeting. All right. Mr. Whedon would like to join, so I will add him right now.
Mr. Barton is adding Mr. Whedon to the meeting.
Yeah.
Might need some assistance from our Zoom host, as I'm not able to add Mr. Whedon.
You need to click. You need to click.
Oh,
Can you hear us, folks?
there we go.
Yes, we can hear you and we can see you.
Yes, we now can see you, Mr. and Mrs. Whedon. Could you just state your name and address for the sake of the record, please?
It's Kevin Whedon and Claudia Whedon at 20 Milton Street.
Thank you very much. Carry on, sir.
Great. So, sorry, I wasn't sure of the process here, but you'd like us now to state any just questions we have, maybe? Is that what you're asking at this point?
Yes.
Okay, sure. So, first of all, thanks, folks. We sent in some concerns and questions last week, and Andrew and Cameron were great to get back to us. We appreciate it. Really, I think we were just hoping to get a little more clarification and maybe some further explanation on a few of the points coming back in the report, guys. So, maybe what I can do, if this is what you see making sense, I can start with a few points and just have you respond to us, if that works okay. Our first question really is just with regard to the lot grading, drainage, and site servicing plan. It's new to us, folks. The one that we saw was, we believe, was conceptual. So we're just not sure today what will happen with us. Do we, when those plans are done, will we have a chance to look at them? We brought in an engineer of our own that looked at that conceptual plan and raised some, we think, very valid questions, but we're not sure as neighbors and citizens if we have the ability to have input into the actual plan that comes forth. Can you just clarify and further explain how this works for us, guys? We just don't really understand.
Mr. Martin or Mr. Miller want to answer that question? Mr. Miller?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Roth. Yes, thank you, Mr. Whedon. So the initial concept that was shown is a preliminary lot grading and drainage plan. Through the building permit process, they'll have to have an approved final lot grading and drainage plan. That is not a public process, so unfortunately it'd be directly with our Public Works Department. Having said that, your comments have been noted and will be forwarded and have been forwarded to our Infrastructure Services Department to this point. So it's my expectation and my understanding that some of those comments will definitely be taken into consideration. If Mr. Martin wants to add anything, but
No, just
Martin?
to clarify, in this case, we have included as a condition of consent. So basically, we would ensure that before the lot is created, that lot grading and drainage can be addressed, and then the plan, as Mr. Miller explained, would then be finalized and approved prior to issuance of a building permit. So there's a couple steps in the process there, but certainly the township standard is to ensure that there's no drainage impacts on neighboring properties. So that your concern is noted, but it's a standard process in involving lot grading, reviewing lot grading drainage plans, is to ensure that that doesn't occur. So there's a couple of checks and balances in place. One is that the lot grading drainage plan would be, identified that it can work before the lot's created. And then the second piece is that a final plan that is based on the actual building plan submitted would then be reviewed and approved before the issuance of a building permit. So there are a couple scenarios in place there, and certainly your comments are noted, but just to emphasize that had you not approached the township with those concerns, those matters would have been addressed regardless. So that it is something that does form part of that standard review. Thank you.
Could carry on.
Okay, thanks, guys. The only other comment I guess we would have is that, yeah, so we won't have any input into that, obviously, and when it's done, if there is a problem, if after all said and done the house is built, the plan is done, and we do see, in this case, water coming onto our property, what recourse do we have? What would we do in that case?
Who wants to tackle that one? Mr. Martin?
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of aspects related to that. There is a security deposits held when a plan is approved before the issuance of a building permit. So then post-construction, there's an as-built survey completed to make sure that it was built in accordance with the approval. So that's the first piece, to ensure that, in fact, it's built the way that was approved, which the approval will ensure that there isn't impacts on the neighboring property. That said, if something were to happen post-construction, after everything is completed, if there's still issues, that there would be the ability then to contact the Township of Wilmot, and our engineering division from Infrastructure Services would be involved in reviewing that to make sure that if in fact there has been a change to what was originally approved. To a certain extent down the road, once everything's built, if it's been verified to comply, securities have been released, if changes happen after the fact, that's the same as any scenario that exists right now. It becomes an issue between two neighboring property owners. But through the construction process, after it's completed and it's verified that everything complies, there's enough checks and balances to ensure there's no issues. But I just didn't want to say that, 5-10 years down the road, if alterations are completed to grading, then we're really in a scenario where we are right now, outside of a development approval process. Basically, it would become a civil matter between the two neighbors. So immediately following construction, within that window of time, if there's issues noted, certainly there's an opportunity to take a look at that. But long term, there aren't municipal controls in place to say that, as with any private property, if someone alters drainage that affects a neighboring property, it's between the two to sort out. So I'm not, that hopefully answers your question a bit. I just didn't want to say that there's a forever date there to make sure that there's never ever an issue, because changes happen to properties all the time outside of the municipality's control.
Thank you.
Okay.
Carry on.
Thanks, Andrew. I think, I think we understand that it's really a wait and see for us, and we hope and have confidence that the checks and balances are there, as you say, to make sure that we're not going to be affected. We know that the lot hasn't been severed yet, but there's already been dirt moved to the back of the new proposed lot, which has already changed the actual site from what it was prior to the starting of this. And I guess our concern is we hope and then again, from what I hear, at the end of the day, we can't be affected, but we already are. And I sent through photos. I hope that yourself and the committee got to see those, that at present we are being affected because of what has happened. We do have dirt coming onto our property. I hope it isn't just understood that it was always that way, that this has already happened due to what's taken place so far already. So I guess I just wanted that noted and I hear you and I appreciate it, that at the end of the day, we won't be affected, and we're just really hoping that is in fact the case. So that's all on that point, guys.
The conceptual plan you have in place was done after they'd already moved dirt and increased the level of the land at the back of the proposed lot.
So
I don't know, Mr. Miller, do
I
you
can just
want to
comment
comment?
slightly on that, but yeah, the changes that have taken place to date will be considered through the future lot grading and drainage plan. The elevations have since changed, and if dirt has been moved on the property, certainly there are some other controls in place, like Mr. Barton was alluding to. There's significant deposits that are held, so if a approval cannot be reached for the lot grading and drainage plan, then the lot ultimately cannot be created. So we're putting the expertise in our engineering division to review this lot grading and drainage plan. Like I said, there's been some fill that has been moved on the property. Ultimately, that will have to be taken into account in a future plan to come up with a solution. During the construction phase, obviously there's going to be, unfortunately, some minor inconveniences through that process, but ultimately through finalization of that construction piece, once all the balances are put into place, then the solution should be a significant improvement to what's occurring right now on the property.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I think that's probably enough on that point. We're assuming that when we get moving forward that there's going to be erosion control put in place, obviously through the process of construction. And again, I say it, but I'm pretty sure that that's what has to happen. I guess it's on record here, but hopefully that's going to take place. The second point we had, folks, is with regard to the setback. I understand from what Mr. Martin and Mr. Miller have told us that there's precedent already in place for a 1.5 meter setback on the side setback. Our question was really, like, everything on our street is at a 2 meter setback. If, in order to have a house built to the size that the developer wants to build, is there no way that we could have moved the house so that we have 2 meters on the west side and only 1 meter on the east side so that the house design doesn't change, but we don't have a house encroaching any more than what would be encroaching on any other property. Most of the houses on Milton Street have much more than, we're the newest house on the street at 35 years old. Most of them have far more than 2 meter side setbacks. And I just brought that forward. Is that not even, can't even be discussed? Is it something that could be considered? You didn't get back to me in your response. So I thought I would ask that question again. Is there any possible way it could be changed to a 2 meter and a 1 meter so that the house size doesn't change? Or is that a non-starting discussion?
Mr. Miller.
Certainly, density standards have changed since the construction of the original house and other ones on Milton Street. Having said that, 1.5 meters isn't introducing a setback that doesn't presently exist in the zoning bylaw. 1.5 meters is the side yard setback for a one-story home within this specific zone. In other zones, a two-story home does have a 1.5 meter setback, and we have, there are some neighborhoods that are as narrow as 1.2 meters, but 1 meter isn't something that has been contemplated often for a main building. There's also some implications on the neighboring property if that were to be contemplated. It's not something that is put forward right now to the committee. However, it's my understanding that, yes, there are some buildings on the retained property, and there may be building code implications for minimum distances for that I may not be aware of. But again, it's not something that is proposed right now to reduce it to 1 meter. I think conceptually the idea was to have two setbacks that were relative in compliance with the underlying setbacks for that zone for a one-story home, whereas a 1 meter would be a significant reduction from 2 meters.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the street, Mr. Mueller, but if you were to go down Milton Street, there aren't many homes, and none of them are closer than 2 meters. So it would just be, in our opinion, by keeping it at 2 meters, it keeps it at least similar to the other homes. And on the east side, there's a huge gap between the existing home and the new proposed home. So you wouldn't look, and it wouldn't, just from an aesthetic standpoint, it would
Many meters.
yeah, it would be many meters away. So that's only our point. And I understand if you're building a new subdivision, sure, I could see putting side setbacks at 1.5 meters for the entire subdivision, but this is not a new subdivision. These are all very old homes with very large setbacks, and why make it any more narrow than it already is really our question to the committee and to yourself. That's all.
If memory serves me correctly, that number has been used a number of times as well. Either one of you want to comment?
Sorry, Mr. Roque, the 1.5 meter number that you're referring to? Yes, that is fairly common and oftentimes for reductions. I am familiar with Milton Street. I'm not far from there personally, so yeah, I am familiar with the street. Again, density standards have changed since a lot of houses have been constructed on that property. In order to accommodate, there is an existing driveway that's present immediately to the south. The thought was with the development concept that was proposed, the applicant has put forward a 1.5 meter reduction, and staff are moving forward on the merits of that certain presentation. If the applicant would like to speak at all to look at potentially reducing that even further, but presently, yes, again, Mr. Roth, 1.5 meter is consistent with what we see in Zone 3 oftentimes, and isn't introducing a setback that isn't uncommon in a lot of residential areas. Mr. Martin looks to add something.
Just one more quick addition, I guess. The 1.5 meters is permitted on that property already for I think Mr. Miller explained that initially in his outline of the report, but excuse me. So a one-story structure could be built at 1.5 meters from the property line presently. So the application isn't contemplating an envelope that's not already allowed by right on that property right now. I understand that, a lot of older neighborhoods, the setbacks are, homes are built further from the property line than that, but in any existing neighborhood, you can build into the compliance of whatever the zoning regulations are. So in this case, regardless of this application coming forward, the building envelope being 1.5 meters from the property line is something that's already permitted. So we're really just debating whether it's a one-story structure or a two-story structure. That's at 1.5 meters. And so I think what Mr. Miller is explaining is we have 1.5 meters is a pretty consistent setback used for 1- and 2-story structures everywhere. It just happens in this case, it differentiates that the 2-story structure is required to be 2 meters. So, long story short, I'm just getting at as much as the house is far from the property lines, there's the existing ability, regardless of this process, to build within 1.5 meters. And from a staff perspective, that's where we're saying, no, it's an appropriate setback for that reason, because they aren't required to be significantly further from the property line right now. It's just there isn't anything there right now, obviously, but they have the current right to do that.
Thank you. And now, normally the delegations are allowed 10 minutes, and we've been certainly lenient, and we don't want to cut you off in any way at all, Mr. Whedon. So do you have anything else that you wish to address?
Yeah, thank you, folks. I didn't realize that. So, okay, so I guess enough said there. The only other question with regard to setbacks is there's a comment in the report, Mr. Martin and Mr. Miller, about the driveway setback at 0.6 meter. Can you just explain that a little further? Am I understanding that the setback on the house would be 1.5 meter, but the driveway would only or could be as close as 0.6 meter? Did I understand that correctly? Could you just clarify that?
So that comment specifically relates to hard servicing within distance to a property line. So the setback for a main building in this case is proposed to be reduced from 2 meters to 1.5 meters. The minimum distance for any hard servicing, which would include a driveway, notwithstanding corner visibility triangles, driveway visibility triangles, is 0.6 meters. So there is a distinction between the two. The driveway on the conceptual sketch is not proposed to be closer or at 0.6 meters to this property line, but there is a distinction between the two measurements, yes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've taken up a lot of your time here. I don't think there's anything else. We have some concerns with regard to the trees and the stumps and the removal, and I did speak to you folks about that, and I guess we're just hoping that isn't going to be an issue with our property, that it doesn't get affected when they actually do that and when the foundation goes in. So unless there's any comment you want to make to me on that, I guess we'll go away knowing that hopefully it won't happen, and if it does, that's going to be something we'll have to work out in the future.
Okay. Is there anything else then that you wish to bring forward?
I don't think, I think if we're running out of time, guys, I think that's, I think we've asked you for our clarification and concern, and we appreciate it. So.
Okay, thank you for your participation. Is there anyone else in the virtual audience that wishes to comment on this application? Mr. Martin, are we aware of anyone?
There is one more attendee. If they wish to speak, if they could use the raise hand feature on the screen, we can add them to the meeting. I'm not seeing any hands raised.
You're not seeing anyone? Okay. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to members of committee.
Sorry, I stand corrected.
I'm sorry.
A hand has been raised now, so
Okay,
we'll just bear with us for a minute while we switch this around.
Okay, we'll wait for a moment then.
And we're not starting video. Is that right?
It's done.
Oh, I don't know if it'll work.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone.
Okay.
My name is Ian Mackay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, you can go ahead.
Hi, I live
Would you-
at 338 Huron Street, and I've been listening to the meeting. I
I'm
understand
sorry,
all the points.
I missed that. Could you give us your name and address again, please, for the record?
Sure. My name is Ian Mackay. I live at 338 Huron Street.
Okay, carry on.
So I'm sort of kitty-cornered to this whole process, and I've just been here listening to the issues that are being brought up. I would like to say that the trees were kind of a sad thing. I'm also concerned, the Grand River is coming out to do an assessment on this, Because a lot of things are going to obviously change with the water flow and stuff to the Grand? Or to the NIF, I'm sorry?
I'm not too sure I have that clear. Mr. Miller, do you want to?
I can answer that, yes. So the rear of the property is regulated by GRCA. A portion is within what's called the River Slopes Erosion Allowance. And so as such, GRCA has requested a geotechnical assessment be completed. And so this is implemented as a condition of consent, meaning that this has to be satisfied prior to the lot being created. And secondly, through the construction of a future dwelling, if this application is approved, they would also need to obtain a GRCA permit for the construction of the dwelling. So there's two separate checks and balances that GRC has in place. Again, it's the geotechnical assessment, that's a requirement of consent, and then secondly, a GRCA permit. And through that, they would look at their policies for development of that property.
Thank you.
Is that also going to be an open forum?
To my knowledge, it's my understanding that the GRCA permit process is not a public setting. However, you can contact a GRCA staff member directly to confirm that if there's any input that you'd like to provide.
Yep.
Okay. And one last question. I'm sorry that I'm making this run even longer. The GRCA, when they do their evaluation, will they send out copies of that to those involved, those bordering the area? In other words, will I get a copy of what's happening with it?
To my knowledge, no, they will not be sending out. They'll do an individual assessment of the property through the, the third party will complete the geotechnical assessment that will be reviewed by staff at GRCA. It's my understanding that there isn't a public notification process through that.
That's correct.
Do they have online copies that I could investigate myself?
No.
To my knowledge, no, but again, you'd be encouraged to contact GRCA directly through that process as it is a separate requirement. They regulate the property, so they have authority in that regard to regulate development of the property. So it's been implemented as a condition, so the lot cannot be created without their approval.
Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Is there anyone else, Mr. Martin, that you're aware of? If not, okay, I will then turn it over to members of committee. Members of committee, do you have any questions or concerns that either the applicant or can address or staff? So, do we have Mr. Miller?
Sure, I guess I have questions for the applicant. What they're proposing is a house that's closer to the one property line than it's allowed. It's on a lot that they're asking to be smaller than is allowed, with a driveway that's wider than is currently allowed, and a garage width wider than is currently allowed. My question, I guess, is both for the applicant and the township. Why do we have these bylaws and restrictions if we're merely going to accept them, all the additions as minor and pass them blindly? The comment was made that you could build a single-story detached home 1.5 meters from the property line. That may be true, but that's not what the applicant's proposing. I know in other applications over the years we've considered the neighborhood quality in passing, for example, sheds that are larger than would be allowed in keeping with the aesthetics of the neighborhood. Here's a situation where this lot, in my opinion, is small, the house is large, and is not in keeping with the consistency of the neighborhood. So I guess my question to the township is, if 4 minor variances isn't considered major, at what point is major?
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Yeah, so several other regulations do comply, namely lot width. So this does meet the minimum lot width requirement, minimum lot area requirement for this property. Albeit,
but that's not the lot width, right?
No,
we have
correct.
Specific restrictions on lot width.
Correct.
Okay.
So there is a distinction between lot frontage and lot width. The lot frontage requirement is measured immediately at the front property line, whereas lot width is measured, in this case, 7.6 meters in, and those requirements are not identical. So lot width is, the minimum lot width, is 15 meters, whereas the minimum lot frontage is 12 meters. And so in part, The intent of that regulation is to combat against pie lots. So in this case, we have a completely rectangular lot, so the determination between the difference between lot frontage and lot width is of no consequence because it's of an equally rectangular lot. So those two measurements are identical. My point being that the lot frontage of this property only needs to be 12 meters, but the lot width has to be 15. So in this case, it exceeds the lot frontage with it being a completely rectangular lot. So the consequence of those two measurements being different is of no impact. And again, it does comply with all the other regulations. We did introduce garage width regulations and driveway width regulations. There are several driveways that exist presently that are much wider than what is proposed currently. But again, it allows us to look at these things on a case-by-case basis. Cumulatively, staff are of the opinion that these are very minor and amount to differences in actual terms, 1 or 2 feet difference here.
Okay.
Again, back to the idea we have a set standard. My understanding is a minor variance should be minor, and it should be accepted by this committee as consistent with the community and what the community would approve and would wish for. And I guess I question that we're at that point.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Martin.
Just one additional comment to kind of elaborate on what Mr. Cameron Miller, not Mr. Miller of the committee. I think what it comes down to is, yeah, it's not a defined term what major and minor is, but really sometimes we look at, certain measurements, certain percentages, whatever that case may be. If we looked at that from a numeric standpoint here, they are very minor. Like the setback reductions, we're talking like 2 feet or less. So whether you look at a 2-story dwelling, whether it's at 1.5 meters or 2 meters, when you're standing looking at that, if you picture holding a piece of plywood in front of yourself and extending your arms the full length, there's no difference. Like so it is from that perspective, we're saying, if it was a 5-meter setback and it was being reduced to 1.5 meters, if you hold a piece of plywood that distance away, you're going to notice a difference. So it's not really a measurable distance. From a staff perspective, we feel it is fairly minor in nature. The garage width and driveway regulations were added 2 years ago, about 2 years ago now. Prior to that, there were no regulations, so certainly there are a number, as Mr. Miller alluded to, a number of properties that have much wider driveways or garages. And that was introduced to provide a measure of control in newer neighborhoods where lots are much smaller than what are being contemplated here, to make sure that the whole front yard isn't used for parking. So certainly in this instance, we're talking about, a 1-foot increase over what the bylaw would allow for. Fairly minor in nature. We're still preserving the fact that the whole entire frontage of the property isn't paved for parking. So I think what Mr. Miller was speaking to is yeah, if we're looking at this would be one we would certainly consider to be minor. There are several requests being filed, but each of them is measurably very minor in nature. And when it comes to the lot frontage, lot size, ultimately, if we look at the lot area and configuration of the property, it's consistent with what the zoning would anticipate. It's just not a pie lot. So ultimately, the bulk of the property is shifted differently than if it were to be a pie lot, but at the end of the day, area and everything else is consistent. So from a township staff perspective, we would certainly suggest that there are several variances being requested, but they are all extremely minor in nature. So we would say that in this case, yeah, this is an appropriate application because they are asking for requests that are very minor and would be consistent with what the zoning contemplates for the area.
I guess I'd throw that back to a question, why have a different setback for a single story than a 2-story if we're not going to honor that?
Well, again, it's not that there is a process anyone can make a request. So the idea of the Planning Act allowing for minor variance applications is to review things on a case-by-case basis. To be honest, why there is a difference between the two going forward, that is something that we potentially should look at as a housekeeping item, because really I think why we would say this is appropriate, because for what I was just explaining, whether it's 1 or 2 feet different, the impact on the property is nothing. So it may be appropriate.
Well, I would disagree, though. If you have a 2-story house up against your property line as opposed to a single-story house, that's a pretty big difference when you're walking down your sidewalk.
Well, yes and no. Again, I use the example of, and again, this is just my thought, but I use the example of holding a piece of plywood arm length away. To me, there's not much difference there. So setbacks really are there to look at ample room for maintenance, lot grading and drainage, those sorts of things. And whether it's 1 or 2 story, all those matters don't really change. So I'm not saying that this is a direction that the township is taking at this point as far as, modifying the zoning to implement only 1 setback, but certainly it's not something that we haven't thought might be appropriate at some point, because really when we're talking about 1.5 and 2 meter setbacks, there's not a lot different. In newer neighborhoods, where, and certainly in other jurisdictions, they've gone down to 0 meter side yards on one side and, 1.5 on the other, so that there's maintenance on one side of the property, the other side is built on the property line. So when we're getting down to that finite of a number, then, then maybe there's, but at 1.5 and 2 meters in today's standards of construction, like that's a pretty significant amount of space to work with. And we would suggest that, really the impact on the property is fairly minimal. So again, we would suggest, certainly from a staff perspective, that it's minor in nature and is consistent with what we would anticipate to see developed in that area.
Okay. Is there anyone else have comments and or questions? Okay, seeing none. The recommendation is that we approve both applications. So I would ask, is there a motion to that effect?
I'll motion to that effect with the, to approve the motion and just that minor tweak to condition 10 as amended to that.
Okay, it's been moved by Mr. Wilmot, seconded by?
I'll second that.
Ms. Lalonde? Thank you very much. Is there any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, all in favor? Opposed? That motion is carried. Thank you very much.
Mr. Roth, just for clarification, that was for the variance. We'll do a separate motion for the consent.
Okay, I'm sorry. I thought we were going to do both of them combined. All right. So I need another motion then. Moved by Ms. Lalonde, seconded by Mr. Bowman. Is there any discussion on this motion? If not, all in favor? Opposed? That motion is carried as well. Thank you. The last order of business is the approval of the minutes of our last meeting. So would someone bring forth that motion? Moved by Mr. Rowe, seconded by Ms. Lalonde. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, that motion, I'm sorry, all in favor? Opposed? Oh yeah, you. Anyway, that motion is carried. Thank you very much. Do we have any applications for January now, or what is it looking like?
We do. Just given the holiday season, I mean, generally they would fall on the first Wednesday of the month, so generally we'd have a meeting that would make it January 4th, but if committee would prefer or cannot attend if we don't have enough members, and we would look to have a meeting on the 11th of January, which would be the following Wednesday.
January the 4th sound okay for everyone? Okay. All right, well, let's try for that then.
Okay, then we'll...
Okay, thank you very much. This meeting is now adjourned. Thank you all for attending.